Howdy, JD the Jungle Dude here. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about America's first fast food, the people who prepared it, and the people who named certain things that we still carry to this day in our lexicon of words in America. All right, first off, let's talk about the hoe cake. Now, hoe cake was originally made out of cornmeal, wheat flour, buckwheat, whatever flour they could get, and they would roast it over a fire, low coals, on a hoe like this, on a flat hoe like this, which was used for actually breaking sod, or a hoe like this, which was used for actually making rows to plant your seeds in. Now, both of those were called and still are called hoes. And so the reason the hoe cake has its name is because they would literally put the batter on the blade of the hoe once they wiped it off, cleaned it off, and they would hold the blade of the hoe over the coals of a fire or a low fire, and then they would use a clasp knife like this or a belt knife, and they would just check it underneath as it got browned but not burnt, and then they would literally use their hand to flip it. And then after it was done, they would put it off into their eating utensils or a clean stone. Now, mind you, this field work went on from 12 to 16 hours. And sometimes they actually brought a lunch with them. And they usually brought the lunch in a pail or bucket, similar to this, or made of wood. And it would be covered with linen. Mine's covered with a cotton bandana because, well, you know, I don't have a huge budget. But these lunch pails or buckets, and that's where the term comes from. A lunch bucket, a lunch pail, they come from the early workers out in the field carrying their lunches in an actual feed pail or bucket. So yes, that's where that came from. Now, when it came down to it, a lot of times after they had had their lunch and everything was emptied out of the pail or bucket, they would send somebody off if they were close enough to a tavern, or if they were lucky enough to be with an army regiment that had beer rations, to go get them a bucket of beer. Now, mind you, they would send as many buckets as they could because it's free beer. And here's the problem. The beer was generally what was called a chalk or a chalk. And it was a precursor to it being distilled into hard liquor. Now, I will go into this in a later video, but right now I want to talk about the fact that engineers, day laborers, they all had beer rations, and basically at the early stages of our nation, there was no big problem with, a 3 bucket beer lunch. And, that doesn't mean that it improved their workmanship, but it sure didn't make them sour to sweat. So they would actually take one of their sandwiches and they would take the top part of the bread that had the butter spread on it, and they would take the butter and they would spread it around with a piece of bread into the rim of the pail or bucket. And it didn't matter if it was wood or if it was actual metal, didn't matter. They did it because, once again, this beer was a chalk. Generally, when it went bad, they didn't get rid of it. They just distilled it into a hard liquor. Waste not, want not. And beer was made out of pretty much any meal that they could find. Yes, there was buckwheat beer, there was corn beer, there was pumpkin beer, there was, yes, all of that. And yes, hops and barley were grown to make beer, but generally beer was made locally, and generally it was very heady. And you didn't have like we have today with a big distillery where everything is pressured and they can check the valve and they can ease the flow. No, it was just a barrel full of fermented grain water that if they didn't relieve the pressure, in many cases would actually explode in the heat, which is why it was kept underground. That's another video entirely. But anyway, it was just an actual spout in a barrel. And they would open it up, and it would hit the bottom of the bucket or pail, and it would create a very large head on it. Once it hit the butter, actually the head didn't come up as bad as it usually did. And so a lot of times people will say, that's a butter in your beer. And it's a rare saying, but you hear people like in the Harry Potter movies say buttered beer or buttered beer. Well, this is actually where the term comes from. And they also, if they had salt, would put salt in the bottom of the bucket. Once again, it dispersed the bubbles, which made the head. And this means they got a full bucket of beer for their money or for the ration, rather than half a bucket of beer because the head and the foam was just that bad. Now, let's talk about something else they cooked on. Shovels. This is a scoop shovel. This is a scoop shovel, and I call it a shovel. And many times they would actually have to get their own meat, or they would have to cook their own meat from a ration. And be it salted, pickled, whatever, they literally did not want to eat it cold because, quite frankly, throughout the ages, military rations have been horrible. And they were back then too. And so they would cook it on a shovel, either the scoop shovel or the spade shovel. Now the spade shovel differed from the scoop shovel because, like it's called a spade, it was made to break earth as well as move it, whereas the scoop shovel was generally used for spreading gravel if they were building up a road, or mulch if they were actually working in a field where they were going to plow and plant food for the military, or, yeah, fertilizer, manure. Generally, these scoop shovels were good for making parched corn if you actually got a ration of unground corn. Yes, they would actually do that. Rather than taking it to the grist mill and have it milled into a corn flour, they would actually give you whole grains. And now, to be honest with you, there's a whole lot of people that talk about whole grain goodness and they eat corn nuts. Well, corn nuts are very American because what that is parched corn. And what they would do many times is if they weren't given a meat ration and they had to get their own meat, they would generally set a snare and they would eat what game they caught in the snare. Or if they had somebody that could actually go out and hunt food for them, they would use whatever game they brought back. And mind you, this is kind of to a lot of people, but they ate stuff like squirrels, grouse, pheasants, groundhogs, raccoons, deer, rabbits. Now, mind you, they would cook generally on the scoop shovel if they had one, if it was larger portions of meat. If they couldn't, a lot of times they would actually cut it up and stew it in an iron pail. But if it was the case where they actually had game meat that they could cook, it was either the spade shovel, which was easy to flip the meat and watch it, and it had a longer handle than the scoop shovel, so it was easier to have a high fire and still not get your pants burned. But when it came to parched corn, scoop shovels were what they wanted to use because they would use the fat from the animal meat that they cooked, and then they would throw the dried corn that they could grind into meal with a rock or whatever they had. And generally, they didn't carry anything to grind the meal, so they would make parched corn. And they would cook it with whatever seasonings they had, and they would enjoy it throughout the day. Many times you would have the whole crew get together and just put everything into a clearing on a cloth where they could actually decide who was going to cook what and what they wanted to eat. Now, mind you, the reason that I'm calling it the original fast food is because most of the meat had to be cut into very small, thin portions. Why? Because you never knew when somebody was going to come in and say, get back to work. It wasn't like nowadays where you had a 30-minute, hour lunch, whatever. They would say, okay, eat, get back to work. And, you know, at the end of the day, if they worked 12, 16 hours, they didn't want to carry anything but their tools they brought in with them. And so, yes, the original fast foods were cooked on shovels and hoes and in buckets. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want, like, subscribe, and come on back, y'all. Anyway, JD the Jungle Dude here, wishing you all peace and peace of mind.